So we're here today to talk about the state, and particularly Lenin's text, The State and Revolution. So it's a text actually that I had some familiarity with, having gone to meetings actually exactly like this. Like in the early days, I was involved in socialist activism. But I actually reread the text when I was a member of the Labour Party, which I'm no longer, but when I was under Jeremy Corbyn. Because there was the possibility that Jeremy Corbyn was going to be elected into government, it seemed particularly urgent at that time to be thinking through the question of the state and how we relate to the state as socialists. And I was kind of looking for answers to the question about, what is the nature of the state? Can it be reformed? Is it an instrument of social transformation, or does it need to be overthrown? And I went to a reading group just like this one actually at the time, and found it a really useful and important experience. And Lenin certainly gives some very clear and uncompromising answers to the questions that I was looking for. And obviously we're not currently in a situation where the left is about to enter government, but I think that these questions are actually always fundamental for activists seeking radical change. And I think it's important for us to think carefully about how the text applies to informing all of our political action and our struggles today. So I've broken down what I'm going to say today into three sections. The first section, I'm going to look a little bit at the context of when Lenin was writing the text, to really make sense of the historical moment from when it emerged. Then I'll go on and summarize some of the key arguments that Lenin makes about the state, and then finally think about why read this text today, how is it going to apply to our organising and activity. Okay, so let's begin with the context then, and actually just want to go back to before the text was written and published, to the outbreak of World War I in 1914, which became a really key moment for Lenin, because the German Social Democratic Party, which at that time was the largest socialist party in Europe, had just voted to support that imperialist war. And Lenin was deeply shocked and enraged by this, because the SDP had repeatedly voted for anti-war resolutions and votes to oppose war, and now it had done the opposite. And Lenin didn't, at the time, didn't mince his words in his criticism of the leadership of the SDP. Called them opportunists who had sold their principles for their careers, called them chauvinists, people who support nationalism and war, and Philistines for being so ignorant of Marxist theory and working class history. We might be tempted to apply some of these terms to part of the left today, but actually for Lenin, attacking the moral fibre and character of the SDP was not enough on its own, but actually what Lenin saw as the betrayal of anti-war politics by the SDP raised some really important questions, which was that how could it be that German socialists, apparently Marxists, who knew the work of Marx and Engels, had voted to support their own state in an imperialist war? Why had they begun to identify with the state rather than opposing their own state? And fundamentally, did this point to a fatal flaw with the understanding of the state to begin with? So the State and Revolution really becomes Lenin's reflection on these important questions, and Lenin was really seeking to reassert the analysis of the state that had already been put forward by Marx and Engels in the 19th century, and sort of continuing it and update it for the context that they found themselves in. So he takes a lot of Marx and Engels' original writing from all sorts of different sources, and then brings that together with the consideration of the revolutionary events in France and the Paris Commune when writing The State and Revolution. Now, it's interesting because Lenin didn't actually finish the final draft of the pamphlet until Russia was then in the middle of revolution, and Lenin was in exile, so in 1917. So many of you will know this history, but in February 1917, the first wave of the revolution saw the 400-year-old Tsarist regime overthrown, and in place there was a provisional government installed that would claim it was going to get rid Russia of its feudal autocratic system of government and introduce a Western-style liberal democracy in its place. But at this same time, what Lenin was observing and was deeply involved in organising was that alongside the provisional government, there was a different power emerging in the working class districts of Russia's industrial cities in particular. And these were these workers' councils or Soviets, which were democratically elected workplace assemblies that were being set up and had actually ended up replacing the state on a localized level. And for Lenin, who was kind of observing what was happening from February 1917 onwards, he could see the potential of the Soviets for turning what was essentially a bourgeois revolution into a socialist one, and that the possibility to do that lay in the power of these workers' councils. So he's thinking through the question of the state and revolution whilst in the middle of doing a revolution, which I think makes it such an important and exciting text to read. And Lenin was actually highly critical of a number of socialists who, rather than supporting the Soviets, which are these, as I said, there's like democratically organised assemblies, some socialists were kind of rushing to occupy seats in the cabinet of the provisional government instead. And what Lenin observed was that these socialists had given up their kind of previously held beliefs that the bourgeois parliamentary system should be overthrown. And actually many of these socialists, what happened instead, kind of in the provisional government, end up defending both state power and private property. They defend continuing the imperialist war, as like many other kind of socialist parties were doing across Europe at the time. The provisional government was still upholding the authority of like officials and bureaucrats, like from within the original state, and the police that had been, importantly, the police that had been inherited from the Tsar. And actually, some of them actually directly opposed the democracy of the Soviets. So there were parts of the provisional government that opposed this kind of workers controlling the factories, the fact that peasant sieges, there'd been seizures of land by peasants, and within the Soviets, the democratization of relationships between officers and men in the armed forces. But the problem wasn't just within the provisional government, but actually Lenin saw in the Bolsheviks, which was the political organization that he was a key member in at the time, but that moderate Bolsheviks were directing party policy whilst Lenin was in exile. So, sorry, I should have said Lenin was in exile just after the February Revolution. And he's writing The State and Revolution, looking and observing about what's happening in Russia. And the moderate Bolsheviks were refusing to call for the removal of the provisional government, despite all of the things that I just mentioned about how it was kind of continuing mainly the functions of the Tsarist state. And these moderate Bolsheviks were kind of offering it conditional support instead. They didn't see the workers' councils that Lenin saw as containing the embryo of a new system of popular self-government. And instead, they kind of argued that the Soviets should exist to hold the provisional government to the sort of liberal democratic promises it had made when it assumed power. So what happens is Lenin comes back, having observed what's been happening, and comes back and then kind of takes decisive action and wins some key arguments like within the Bolsheviks about what should be done in terms of the strategy next. And what he does, and this is why it's so relevant when we're talking about the state, is that he says that he rejects this attitude of accommodation to the provisional government, and instead argues for an uncompromising opposition to the state, and that for the workers' councils to take power from it. So this demand was encapsulated in the slogan, "Down with the provisional government, all power to the Soviets." So Lenin's writing The State and Revolution like at the same time as actually doing revolution and coming up with this theory at the same time as actually putting the theory into practice, which makes it so extraordinary, I think, because Lenin was highly focused on the fact that this liberal bourgeois revolution of February 1917 needed to be transformed into a socialist one. And he's writing The State and Revolution during this time, and the intention was really to arm the activists of his own party with the theory necessary to make this socialist revolution. And actually, it says in the preface to the text, Lenin writes that the question of the state is, I quote here, acquiring not only practical political importance, but also the significance significance of a most urgent problem of the day, the problem of explaining to the masses what they will have to do before long to free themselves from capitalist tyranny. And we're going to get I'm going to shortly get into discussion of the arguments in the text itself, but I think it is really important as context for as we read it that we might have it was kind of fashionable on the left for a while to say that, like, talking about political theory was beyond the reach of ordinary people, but Lenin wrote this text like to be read by the ordinary men and women of Russia who were taking part in this revolution. And there are long quotations in it from Marx and Engels, and that's mainly to avoid some of the distortions of theory that had been taking place at the time. But it is a hugely readable text. It's not long. It's written in a very sharp polemical style. So I do recommend reading it if you haven't done already. And I think what is fascinating is that actually the October Revolution, which would become the Socialist Revolution, would actually break out before the text was finished, or published, and that Lenin had actually won the Bolsheviks round to a position that was crucial for their action to turn the bourgeois revolution into a socialist one. And actually, Lenin spent the rest of his life in the leadership of this new revolutionary government. So the text is actually unfinished. And like Lenin says about the unfinished manuscripts, it's, and I quote, "It is more pleasant and useful to go through the experience of revolution than to write about it." As someone trying to write about teaching at the moment, rather than actually doing the work of teaching, I feel Lenin's pain here. I'm not saying I'm trying to make a revolution happen, but I think there's certainly something to be said for the writing can be harder than the doing. But I think what makes this such, as I said before, what makes it such an interesting text for us to read is that read together, as socialists, is that the question of whether the state should be overthrown, which was the question I started with, was actually decisively answered by Russian workers, by Russian soldiers, and by Russian peasants themselves, in the October Revolution, that the state was overthrown. And so this text is important because it's actually theory that then explains the reality. So that's why I find it really exciting and find it so interesting. So with all of that context in mind, thinking about when this was made, well, what is Lenin's argument about the nature of the state, both from his observations of the Russian Revolution and also of the Paris Commune? What does he say is the nature of the state, and what does he say about how it should be related to in a revolutionary context? And Lenin actually makes 4 conclusions, which I'm going to outline first and then kind of look at each one in turn. So the first point is that the state is a product of class society, and that the state cannot reconcile the conflicting interests of these classes, despite those who claim that it can. His second key argument is that the state exists to impose the order of the ruling class, over the exploited masses. The third is that to maintain this order will require what Engels calls special bodies of armed men, which we'll look at a little bit more. And finally, the key thing is that for a socialist, the argument that Lenin makes is that a socialist revolution is necessary to overthrow the existing state, impose what is called a dictatorship of the proletariat, which we'll look at in some more detail, which would then eventually wither away as class society is dissolved. I know that last bit can sometimes be the most difficult to get your head around, so we'll spend a bit of time thinking about it together shortly. So just beginning with the first point then, so that the state is a product of class society. So Lenin bases this part of his analysis actually on Engels' Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State. Some of you, I think, will be familiar with it, but this is where Engels argues that no state, as we understand it now, existed in early human societies. So when I say early human societies, I'm talking about primitive and communal societies. We might think of hunter-gatherer societies or early self-governing tribal communities. And these early human societies that Engels talks about were based on cooperative labour, on collective ownership and equal share. And what Engels kind of argues, and what from an observation of history, is that states actually begin to emerge when these societies begin to break up into opposing social interests. So where we begin to see the development of agricultural surplus and accumulation, and then the development of private property, and really what we're talking about here is the early stages of class society, is that We see that those who have the means of producing wealth then come into conflict with those whose labour needs to be exploited to produce that wealth. And the state emerges as part of this. So once you have the initiation of class society, you then have conflict, because these classes have conflicting economic interests, and the state emerges in order to mediate these interests. Because what Engels says is that if you have two conflicting classes, then they could exist in a permanent state of conflict, like what Engels calls quote, fruitless struggle, that is, struggle not productive for accumulation, basically. So the state is there to try and stop this just being an endless struggle and conflict, and the state is therefore there to in effect stand above society to mediate the conflict, keep it within the bounds and order. Now, what is argued by Marx and Engels and continued very much by Lenin, like in the pamphlet, is that the state does in some way stand above society, but it's not a neutral arbitrator between the different classes and different social interests. And actually, Lenin starts off right at the beginning of the pamphlet by criticising kind of liberal Enlightenment conception of the state, which might be familiar to us. So he's kind of strongly arguing against Hegel's description that the state is the, quote, the reality of the ethical idea, or quote, the image and reality of reason. And, in this conception of the state, which Lenin is arguing against, it suggests it's a place where parties with different interests meet to reconcile and govern. And, we see this in liberal conceptions of particularly technocratic approaches to the state, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, where it kind of assumes that there's like one best way to govern, if only we can find the ideal solution that works in the kind of common interest of everyone, and that the state is a neutral institution whose purpose is to safeguard a common good or a common interest. And whether conservative or liberal politicians, we see this a lot in this kind of idea that we're all in it together, that of national interest. I mean, most recently we saw this during the COVID pandemic, obviously, with particularly at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, where Keir Starmer was saying that this wasn't the time to criticise Boris Johnson or play politics, that COVID affected us all equally, and therefore we had to have this this kind of blitz spirit, and obviously completely masking the ways that COVID manifestly obviously affects working class people, and as we've seen with all the kind of toxic revelations that have come out of Partygate and many other ways that COVID has affected the ruling class differently to working people. So this idea that we're all in it together is obviously is nonsense, and Lenin is arguing directly against this kind of liberal conception of the state, that it's a neutral institution. And it's also actually important to say, sorry, I should have said that this idea of the state as a neutral instrument is actually held by reformists as well, who might, on the surface at least, seem to have similar political aims to us, but who believe that essentially the state can be overtaken by kind of socialist politicians, and that suitable reforms can be put in place, and the state is neutral, that it can just be orientated in the direction of serving the common good, if not the national interest. But Lenin is absolutely crystal clear in this explanation that the state is not a neutral body in the interest of the common good. Well, why? So, I mean, the first thing to say is that really the way that Lenin, and continuing from Marx and Engels, describes it is that the state's role is to maintain order. And when there's conflict, and this is always going to mean defending the existing order. It's going to mean defending the status quo. It doesn't mean defending a hypothetical socialist order of the future, but it's defending the status quo. The second reason why it can't be neutral is that the class which owns society's wealth also controls the state, and that's actually true whether whether you've got a parliamentary democracy or not. Whatever the class is that owns society's wealth also controls the state. And I mean, we only need like a kind of cursory glance of history to show that states have always been comprised of the economically dominant classes. So I'm sure how I'm doing for time. Yeah, okay, I'm okay for time. And the final thing just to say about the nature of the state as a sort of expression of ruling class interests is that Lenin makes the argument that the state is actually firstly the concentrated expression of ruling class interests, but it's also a body for sorting out the affairs of the entire ruling class as well. And partly that's because like ruling elites in society are not always unified in the action that they want to take. We saw this vividly, of course, in the debates about Europe and Brexit, when the ruling class was absolutely split on what to do and what direction. As with Brexit, we see how nasty these arguments can become, and the role of the state in that context becomes to hold these warring factions and groupings together. Why is that important? Because splits in the ruling class, of course, open up space for insurgency from below, and the state needs to avoid doing that at all costs. So when you have this insurgency, it becomes very, very clear that the state actually is an organ for the oppression of one class by the other. It's to prevent working people and the ordinary masses from rising up when there is times when the ruling class itself is split. So, I mean, how do they do that? How does the state maintain order? How does the state exist in order to make that happen? Well, for those of you who did your homework and you did your reading, Shiny Apple from Miss Rigby, you might have come across the metaphor of the state being like a house with different rooms of varying importance. And this is important for thinking through like how the state manages to maintain order. And I think it's a really useful metaphor. So let's say we think of the state as a house. So the most important room, let's say the cellar, is where what Engels calls the special bodies of armed men and women are housed. And here we're talking about the army, the police, the prison system, the obviously repressive state functions. And actually, we often only see them come out of the cellar when ruling class power or wealth is itself being challenged. I mean, we can think of many examples of this, I'm sure, of the repressive function of the state, and I'm sure we can talk about it more in the discussion. But on a kind of like localized level, obviously recently, the disgraceful attacks on women at Clapham Common who were protesting the murder of Sarah Everard. Just this week in Dalston, we saw protesters trying to stop the deportation of a migrant, and police viciously responding with batons and attacking protesters there. And of course, anyone involved in any protest over the years will have their own examples: the student protests, the miners' strikes. Any time when ruling class power and interests are being challenged in the streets, the coercive powers of the state come into view that are often kept in the cellar below. And as well as the police, like Lenin outlines how the army are essential in protecting ruling class interests as well. I know that probably this was discussed a little bit last week when Shabir was talking about Lenin's ideas on imperialism, but I think it's important to think about how the army really meets this idea of like being special bodies of armed men separate from society. So soldiers are uniforms, they live separately in barracks, they are very much separate from society, protecting ruling class interests, both internally and externally. We don't often see it internally, but I do remember during the London riots when following the murder of Mark Duggan by police, and there were riots throughout London, the only place the army was deployed during the London riots was to protect Westfield Shopping Centre. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but it just so strongly highlighted how the interests of the state and the ruling class really are one. But obviously the army is there also to protect from external threats as well. So Lenin makes it really clear that the armed forces of the state are essential to defending, expanding, or destroying territory, because states are in geopolitical rivalry, and the army serves this kind of as a special weapon in the hands of the ruling class. Okay, so if the cellar holds the special bodies of armed men, then what are the other rooms of this house of the state? So another important room is the front room, which is the showroom, and that is Parliament. And so this is obviously where the rules and regulations of society are made. And the reason we call it in this metaphor the showroom is that it's the place the ruling class wants us to see, because the idea of liberal democracy is anyone can become a MP if they get elected, or so they tell us. It's held up as a place of democracy, and it's the kind of democratic fig leaf that hides the state, essentially, hides the kind of more coercive functions of the state. And again, it's really important that in Engels and then Lenin's conception that these people are separate from the masses of ordinary people. So, you know, Parliament really maintains this idea that politics is a preserve of this special body known as politicians, and you only have to watch like anything in the House of Commons to see how far removed Westminster feels from ordinary life, and that Parliament is this special place where politics is said to be legitimately done. Obviously, anything outside of Parliament, you know, organisations like Stop the War and the People's Assembly, they're not real politics. And, you know, actually, it's not just always an objection to what organisations like this say, but actually it's the demonstration that politics should be a mass affair that extends beyond the narrow confines of Westminster that is also challenging in and of itself. And so the final room in the house is kind of the back rooms, the shady rooms, the smoking room, which is what Lenin refers to as the executive. And so this is where Lenin says the real business of the state is carried out here behind people's backs. And rather than elected politicians, we're talking here about unelected but powerful civil servants. So, you know, this is the space where top civil servants and advisors and lawyers, it's kind of shrouded in mystery. For any fans of the thick of it, it's the sort of like chaos of the ministers and civil servants working together to block each other or stop each other, and things like that. And we can think about perhaps ways that we actually are able to see the executive like in our day-to-day now. But of course, even these ways of both executive and Parliament don't work. And this is when to just wrap up the house metaphor, this is when the doors of the cellar are opened, basically, and the repressive forces of the state are let out into the street. When you have, when Parliament and the executive fails to contain the clash between classes, this is when you therefore see the kind of repressive forces of the state. So these are the kind of three key functions. So we have the armed body of people, we have the bourgeois parliament and the state bureaucracy. But I actually just wanted to clarify something here, which I think is important, because when we say the state now, we might think that we're talking about like schools and the NHS and welfare benefits and things like that. And I just wanted to kind of offer some historical context on this, because when Lenin's writing, like, the state doesn't actually consist of these things. Like, it doesn't really consist of anything more than its repressive law and order functions. Like, taxes were low, there was no welfare provision, like most of the government budget was spent on the army. So when Lenin's talking about the state, he's not so much talking about things like schools and hospitals. And I think that when I was trying to think it through, I think, you know, people who work in schools, in hospitals, things like this, they're not made up of special bodies of people separate from society. You know, teachers and nurses work from within society itself. An interesting question, which I might be interesting to talk about in the discussion, is that, like, how parts of the welfare state do end up playing a punitive and coercive role. I certainly see this kind of play out in schools, you know, in sanctioning, in job centres, things like that, but that might be something for us to discuss further. So now we have an understanding of what the state is and how it functions. The question is, well, what do we do? What do we do? So, and Lenin asked this question: by what is the smashed state machine to be replaced? So Lenin is inspired by and draws heavily on Marx's description of the Paris Commune from the text "The Civil War in France." And many of you will know the extraordinary and inspiring history of the Paris Commune, which is that for 2 months between March and May 1871, Paris had been controlled by a revolutionary socialist government brought to power by working class insurrection. And in the text, Marx is like ecstatic about the Commune's heroism and idealism. He said that the communards had been, quote, storming heaven in their revolutionary activity. And Lenin reminds us that Marx is particularly celebrating like a new type of state that had emerged, and that the communards had destroyed the state and replaced it with a very different organisation and structure. So the Commune abolished the regular army and the parliamentary system. Parliament was replaced with a citywide network of popular assemblies. The Commune's representatives were elected on the basis they could be deselected at any time. And not only that, you know, today the salary of an MP is like more than twice the average salary. The communards and state officials were only allowed the average workman's wages. And alongside this, there was a creation of a democratic militia. So the Commune ensured that the special bodies of armed men were replaced by armed people. So what's the significance of this? Because in the State and Revolution, Lenin goes into some detail talking about the Paris Commune and why. What does it mean for revolutionary organising? What does it mean for our relationship to the state? Well, firstly, Lenin says that observing the Paris Commune confirms the idea that the existing capitalist state can't simply be taken over, but it has to be overthrown and replaced with a new kind of people's state. And Lenin quotes Marx saying, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes, and instead says that with the Paris Commune was, I quote, essentially a working class government, the product of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labour. So the Paris Commune really reveals to Marx and Engels and then to Lenin too that it's necessary to smash the state, to smash the bureaucratic military machine. But importantly, this did not mean that the state would immediately be abolished, but instead, that power would pass from one form of state to another. And this is where we get to the idea, Marx's idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, the language of this obviously can cause some discomfort now. We associate the word dictatorship with repression or, violation of human rights. But actually, it's important to see it in the context it was written, which was that Lenin was really writing against the anarchists who believed the state could simply be abolished overnight. The anarchist slogan was "Don't take power, smash it." And actually, like the anarchists, Lenin thought that the capitalist state also needed to be destroyed immediately. Like Lenin did agree with the anarchists in that state. But he saw that another type of state would be necessary in a revolutionary context because the concentrated power of capital, the state and the ruling class was so strong. So this is why he really thought that there had to be this this kind of transitional workers' state. How am I doing for time? I feel like I'm going. How long have I got left?
About 5 minutes-ish.
5 minutes. Okay, perfect. All right, I'm coming. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay. So, yes. Okay. So, so he really was arguing against anarchists and thought that you needed to have this dictatorship of the proletariat or a workers' state. And there were kind of two main reasons for that. The first was that Lenin was aware that the workers themselves in this new state would have to learn from the experience of self-government. So they'd need to receive training in it. They'd need to acquire and develop new capacities for new experiences, because this would be a learning experience to be running the state. But more ominously, there would also need to be a transitional state, a workers' state, because of the threat to the revolutionary state. So, Lenin says that the day after revolution, it's not very realistic to believe that those that hold wealth and power will turn around and say, okay, you've won, like, over to you. And actually, history has shown us that a fallen oppressor is as dangerous as a wounded beast. We only have to look at the way that the heroic men, women and children of the Paris Commune were so violently butchered by the state when the Paris Commune was finally suppressed. And there's sadly many other examples in history of this being the case. So Lenin argues that the state would still be needed to defend the revolution, and it would need to be able to respond to any counter-revolution that might appear. So once you have this new workers' state, or actually Lenin describes it in different terms, a semi-state, a non-political state, or simply sometimes a proletarian state. After this transitional period, Lenin outlines that this would lead to, quote, a withering away of the state altogether. What does this mean, this withering away of the state? Like, what would be the conditions for this? Well, it becomes very clear that this would happen when, firstly, the old ruling class order has been swept away and cannot recover. Secondly, when the new socialist system is wholly secure. Thirdly, when a society of cooperative producers, like organised democratically with equal rights, has come into existence. And obviously, if you had those things, then we would be talking about a socialist society where class had disintegrated. And if you have the disintegration of class, you have the disintegration of class antagonisms, and the class basis for the state too then disappears. If the state is only there to mediate between the two classes, if you have a socialist society that has become classless, then the state eventually withers away. So that's the main argument that Lenin makes. So I'm just going to wrap up with some final comments about what all this means for us today, like why this text, why read something written 100 years ago, what does it mean for us? And I think that Marx and then continued Lenin's theory of the state, based on their revolutionary experience, has to be one of the essential building blocks to any serious attempt, I think, to change the world, because we've seen time and time again that when working people move into revolutionary action, they always find their way blocked by the capitalist state. And we have direct experience of this, how this has played out in the last decade, particularly the experiences of political parties of the left in Europe. And the situations are complex, but there's certainly something to be argued that these projects have at best underestimated, at worst ignored the question and role of the state. So we have the example of Syriza in Greece, obviously a particularly tragic example of this. Syriza elected on a wage of huge popular mobilizations in Greece, promising to overturn the program of austerity that was immiserating them. But Syriza significantly underestimated the way that the globalized institutions of the state, the EU, the central bank, which actually, by the way, act in a very similar way to Marx and Lenin's description of the nation state. This is the kind of international rescaling of coercive control in the form of the European Union and the central bank. Syriza thought they would be able to negotiate their way into radical reforms, for the Greek people. But ultimately, had Syriza been successful in this, they would. I feel sure they would have set off a wave of uprisings across Europe against globalized capital, and of course, the international ruling class was never going to allow this to happen. So, in the end, Syriza and the Greek people were, as the expression goes, crushed by banks, not tanks. This act of economic warfare. And said that the Greek people must submit, and we to even greater austerity. And of course, the Syriza leadership retreated. But closer to home, and this is going to be my final kind of points, obviously we have the experience of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. So Jeremy Corbyn was never actually elected into government, but I think it's actually important and worthwhile to think through what might have happened if he was, and how we would have seen these functions of the state that Lenin outlines in the text, which is that, firstly, Corbyn's kind of avowedly anti-war positions were the ones that were the most attacked throughout his tenure, the most vicious forms of attack. And we know he would have almost certainly been blocked by the army and the secret services. Some of you might remember that there was a kind of rogue general that actually nakedly expressed this in 2017, who said that if Corbyn tried to scrap Trident or pull out of NATO, there would be a mutiny in the army. And we can only imagine how much more that would have escalated did he come to power. At the level of bureaucracy, we already saw hints of what may be to come. We've got unelected officials like Peter Mandelson saying that he did something every day to prevent Jeremy Corbyn coming to power. That's even before he's got there. And finally, I don't think any of us would have been under much illusion that the bulk and the rump of the Labour Party MPs who went into Parliament with Corbyn, where he ever had been elected, would have voted through the radical policies supported by the people or the membership and would have blocked him in every way. And had Corbyn gone into government, I think, we need to make clear that he would have been in government, but he wouldn't have had power over the state. So, the conclusions that may have been drawn from this could have had radical conclusions, as if we're learning from Lenin there. But I think what's really important is that this text does remind us that we must still work within movements. Lenin makes it clear that there's no argument for ignoring Parliament or even boycotting working with those people in the Labour Party, because actually it's in our political struggles, where we work alongside people with shared political objectives, defending the NHS or pensions, or in our trade union branches or on strike. These are moments when we build political relationships with activists, where we can disseminate the deeper understanding of the state that we're talking about here today, from revolutionaries to those in the movement who might be open to our ideas. And I know that Michael is going to talk more next week about the relationship of the party to class, but I think that this has big ramifications for how we organise revolutionary organisations as well. That if we have a highly organised...
I need to wrap up soon, if that's all right, sorry.
I'm basically done. So I think that all of this is really important part of our work as revolutionaries, and I really hope that we can continue to continue this discussion, think about the application of it and how they apply today, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. I got really excited about Lenin, so I know I've gone over time by loads. So really, please, I hope your patience is allowed. But I'm really looking forward to talking about it, thinking about how Lenin applies today. And yeah, thank you very much.